welcome everyone to the next new moon forecast. And this new moon is a very special new moon. We are entering into the Leo lunation cycle. And since I started this workshop series, I've been naming each one of the workshops after the sign that the sun is moving throughout the course of that lunation. So from new moon to full moon to the next new moon. But what is special about this new moon is that it's the second new moon taking place in the sign of Cancer. So the first new moon took place on June 20th, right at 0 degrees Cancer. So right at the beginning of that sign, the same day that the sun had shifted out of Gemini and into Cancer. But because a sign has 30 degrees in it, and there are 12 signs in the zodiac, so 360 degrees in a circle, if you remember from your geometry lessons. The moon moves in its cycle just a little bit faster than that. And so we occasionally get a second new moon or a second full moon in the same sign. And a second new moon, where the sun and the moon are conjunct each other, they're next to each other in the sky. A second new moon is called a black moon, and a second full moon is called a blue moon. The term blue moon is a little bit more popularized, like that doo-wop song from the 1950s, Blue Moon. And I think it shows up in a lot of kind of poetry and other artistic motifs. But a black moon is a second new moon rather than full moon. And I want to thank Constance Wallace for drawing my attention to that. In the last forecast, I actually referred to this second new moon as a blue moon. So I stand corrected, and not only corrected, but delighted to learn something new, and that there is a differentiation between these two second new and full moon names. So that second new moon, the black moon, will be taking place on Monday, so July 20th. And it's a pretty potent time leading up to that alignment. I'm going to share the transits I'll start off actually with the transits for today, just so you can see what's happening. So here we are. Today is Friday, July 17th. And here's the sun at 25 degrees Cancer. And so it's near the end of that. It's near the end of that sign. And here is the moon approaching the new moon. So we've got a few more days until that happens. And what I want to draw your attention to, this is actually something that I spoke about right at the end of the last workshop, which is that the sun is sweeping in opposition to the Jupiter, Pluto, Saturn stellium that's over here in Capricorn, that has really been dominating the world transits throughout this year. As many of you have heard me speak about before, it is this Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto stellium that is connected to the coronavirus pandemic and so many of the major conflicts, tensions, crises, difficulties, challenges that have been unfolding in not just this last year, where it's been especially amplified by Jupiter's presence, but really the last couple years since Saturn and Pluto came into orb with each other in early 2018. So over the last several days, the last week, the sun has been moving in opposition to that stellium. And in the world transits, when the sun moves in alignment, major alignment to any other planet, it tends to bring the focus there, right? That makes sense at a symbolic level because the sun illuminates, it sheds light on what it touches. And so in this case, what it is shedding light on is the Jupiter, Pluto, Saturn stellium. So on Tuesday, Tuesday the 14th, the sun was exactly opposite Jupiter. So really highlighting Jupiter's expansive qualities, growth, wealth, abundance. But it wasn't just highlighting Jupiter on its own. Like a Sun-Jupiter alignment on its own is really lovely. I mean, it's jovial and filled with laughter and hope and optimism. But Pluto is lingering right there in the shadows. The image that comes to me when I think of this is like the Plutonic dragon guarding its gold. I thought it was really interesting that this lined up, at least in the US, with tax day. So our extended tax day this year that was pushed from April 15th to July 15th happened to be that the day before tax day, when I imagine a lot of people were doing their taxes, the sun is opposing Jupiter and really focusing on money, abundance, wealth, or showing up the shadow side, maybe the lack thereof, especially considering what the economy is like right now. So the sun also moving in that opposition to Pluto. Pluto brings in intensity, depths, extremes. It pushes us to the edge. And it makes me curious how many of you have had really intensified weeks or this past week feeling really kind of extreme, intense, maybe the sun highlighting different elements, shadowy dynamics, power dynamics, internal struggles. It's kind of like the hidden underbelly of the beast that's getting highlighted here. And then when we come to the day of the black moon, the next new moon, let me show you what that looks like. All right, so this is at the exact time of the new moon on Monday, July 20th. It'll be at 10:33 in the morning Pacific time. And you can see here that sun moon conjunction taking place at 28 degrees Cancer. And the new moon is happening right in opposition to Saturn. Look at that. They're all at the same degree, 28 degrees in their respective signs. And so not only is it a new moon, it is opposite Saturn. So bringing in all of those Saturnian qualities of limit, discipline, hard work, loss, potentially suffering, negation, time, structure, all of those qualities of Saturn are standing in opposition, literally, that 180-degree opposition that you see there, standing in opposition to the new moon. And so there's a seriousness, a heaviness to this particular new moon. It may feel very weighty, like a weight of personal responsibility coming in, and also a quality of emotional heaviness, because that's what the moon brings into this equation. We feel Saturn's lack and limitation, the way that it blocks and negates and cuts us off. So Monday may feel like a heavy day. When we set our seeds of intention into the soil for this new moon, for those who have that kind of intentional new moon practice, this may feel like a very serious act, something that really carries a lot of gravity, gravitas, a sense of importance, maybe even a karmic quality that we are planting in the soil here. Something I touched on briefly last time is looking at the significance of having two new moons in Cancer and how that balances out in terms of all the other new moons that we have throughout this year. So we won't get a new moon in Leo until the end of the Leo lunation cycle, which is the cycle that we're going to be exploring together today. And the way that I've been thinking about this is that we have an opportunity to set our intentions, to plant our seeds twice this year in lunar soil, in Cancerian soil. And I wanted to share with you what is called the Thema Mundi, the world theme. So this is an image. Let me just pull this up for a moment. So this is an image that comes out of traditional astrology, and it demonstrates very beautifully and elegantly all of the planetary rulerships of the 12 signs of the zodiac. And so you can see here's Cancer. So this is the sign that we're having our second new moon in. And you can see it's ruled by the moon. And then here, the next sign over is Leo. That's what the sun is going to be moving into just in a few days. So that'll be on June 22nd that the sun ingresses or moves into the sign of Leo. And the notice when you look at the Thema Mundi that there's one sign ruled by the moon. There's one sign ruled by the sun. And then it pans out from there, showing the Mercury ruled signs on either side, so Gemini and Virgo. And then it pans out again. You see the Venus ruled signs, Taurus and Libra. And even further, you have Mars ruling Aries and Mars ruling Scorpio. And then even further, you see Jupiter ruling Pisces and Jupiter ruling Sagittarius. And then finally, we conclude, because remember, this is from ancient astrology. This is before this Thema Mundi, the world theme, was created, was crafted before the outer planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, were discovered using a telescope, using modern technology. And so we see the last two signs of Aquarius and Capricorn ruled by Saturn. And so it's a very elegant design and deeply symbolic, so many interconnected meanings with how these signs are all related to each other, this whole 12, and how it's related to the ancient 7 planets, these gods of the celestial world. So notice, just one ruled by the moon and one ruled by the sun. And this year, we're having a second new moon in Cancer, a second new moon in the moon ruled sign. And the moon is the archetype of the emotions, the feelings, the home, the family, the domestic sphere, the inner world, the community. The moon, in a lot of ways, symbolizes the whole, the matrix of which we are a part. So when the sun is dominating the sky, it is daytime. It is the only light in the sky. But when the moon is out, whether it is a full moon or just a crescent moon, we can see the other stars. And so it is a symbol of the whole. It is a symbol of the many, just like the sun is a symbol of the one. And I've been contemplating this difference, this solar-lunar dichotomy, really of community and self, of the whole and the part. And that this year, 2020, this most challenging year, where so many people are isolated, feeling cut off from community, and where there's a lot of struggle to really come to terms with what it means to take care of a community, to take care of the whole, to make sure that everyone's needs, their health and financial, their survival needs are met, that it's this year that we have this opportunity to plant a second seed of intention in that lunar, community-oriented sign of Cancer. So that's something I've been contemplating around this particular theme. And I also just wanted to share that beautiful image of the Thema Mundi with all of you as well. So you can just see the gorgeous elegance of how the rulerships of each of the signs is laid out. So going from there, we're going to be moving through, as I have done in the past, the lunation cycle, the scaffolding, as I like to call it, of the month, moving from new moon to waxing quarter moon to full moon to waning quarter moon, and then finally to the new moon itself. And there of course is more to that cycle than just those 4 quadrature alignments, we call them. So if you hear an astrologer refer to a quadrature alignment or an angular alignment, what they're referring to are those 3 angles, or what are called hard aspects, or you may sometimes hear them called dynamic aspects. That's the conjunction, where they're next to each other, the square, where they're 90 degrees from each other, the opposition, where they're 180 degrees opposite each other. So those three are the hard aspects or the dynamic aspects. Now, there are 2 other major aspects that astrologers look at, and you can see that in the lunar cycle as well. They don't have quite the same apparent quality. The new moon and the full moon, we really notice. And in a lot of ways, I think we can notice the quarter moon, the waxing or waning quarter moon as well, because you look up in the sky and, oh, the moon, it's half lit, and the other half is in darkness. But the other 2 are the sextile, 60-degree angle, and the trine, 120-degree angle. And if you follow along or read the transit updates that I post on my website or send out to my email list or post on social media, I do often write a description for the sun-moon sextile. And so the waxing crescent when it's getting bigger, and then when it's coming back toward the new moon, what's called the disseminating moon. Those are the 2 sextiles, 60-degree angles of the moon to the sun. And then the trines I will also write about. A trine, when you look up in the sky and you see the moon in a trine to the sun, I find it to be a really beautiful illumination, because the moon is more lit than the quarter moon, where half is light and half is dark. When the moon is in a trine to the sun, it's a little bit fuller. Like, you feel the pregnancy of the moon with that, especially with the waxing trine, because it's the last major aspect between the moon and the sun before the full moon. So I do write descriptions of those that you'll come across if you follow along with those transit updates. They have a more harmonious dynamic, so they also don't stand out quite as much as those angular relationships. So I'm going to be moving through the dates for this month's lunation cycle, starting off, of course, with Monday's black moon, Monday's new moon, and then moving through each of those quadrature alignments, touching on what the other transits are that are coloring the quality of that time. And then I'll have a few more things to share: Mercury and Venus moving into new signs, and also an update on what Mars is doing for the next, not just the next month, but for the next 6 months or so. So let me share the chart with you again. Here it is. Again, this is Monday. This is the new moon. And as we move from the new moon to as you can see, this is in the last 2 degrees of Cancer, and then the sun on July 22nd. So just 2 days later, the sun will ingress into Leo. So the one sun ruled sign of the year. And because the Leo is ruled by the sun, and the sun is the archetype of the self, the individual, the identity, what we shine as. That's how it shows up in terms of natal charts, personal charts. When the sun is home, in its own sign, the one sign that it rules, it really wants to shine. It's a fire sign. And in the northern hemisphere, at least, this is the midpoint of summer. It tends to be the hottest time of year. I know I'm speaking a little in a bit of a biased way right now because my environment as I'm talking is quite warm. So I'm feeling that summer heat coming in, and I know it's shaping my language as I'm writing about the sun in Leo or about Mars's fiery heat. So there probably is a little bit more emphasis on that warmth right now, just in my own archetypal thinking. So July 22nd, the sun ingresses into Leo. And then the rest of the lunation cycle takes place in fixed signs. Now, we spoke a little bit last time, for those who were here, about the three modes of the signs. There are cardinal signs, those which start off each season. Then there are fixed signs, those which are at the middle of each season. And then finally, there are mutable signs, that which changes out or ends each season. So this lunation cycle will be taking place in fixed signs. And the reason for that is because because the modes, those three different types of sign, they're always in an angular relationship to each other. So the oppositions, they're always the same mode, and the squares, they're always the same mode. That is what the relationship is between those signs. So let me show you what this looks like. And also just to name what the fixed signs are so you know what I'm talking about. Leo, of course, is one of the fixed signs. So that's what the sun will be in this entire month. And then the next fixed sign out from there is Scorpio. So that's the sign that the sun moves through in the middle of autumn in the northern hemisphere. And then the next fixed sign is Aquarius. So that's what the sun moves through in the middle of winter in the northern hemisphere. So Aquarius and Leo are opposite each other. Scorpio is square, 90 degrees to each of them. And then finally, the last of those fixed signs is Taurus. So Taurus is the sign that the sun moves through in the middle of spring in the northern hemisphere. Now, for those who happen to be raised perhaps with a Christian background or with some familiarity with the Christian mythos, the particular animals or the figures, the symbols associated with those four fixed signs may seem a little familiar. Leo, we have the lion. Taurus, we have the bull. Aquarius, we have the man, the water bearer. And then finally, Scorpio. Well, typically we think of a scorpion, of course. There is another animal that symbolizes Scorpio, and that's the eagle. So the lion, the eagle, the bull, and the man. If you happen to have a Christian background or familiarity with Christianity, these are the four animals of the Gospels. So those four fixed signs of the zodiac happen to find themselves as the four symbols of the four writers of the four Gospels. So that's an interesting connection between astrological symbolism and biblical symbolism. So as we move from the new moon, that's almost in Leo, but not quite, in Cancer, then we come to the waxing quarter moon. So moon square to the sun. And you can see here's the sun now in Leo. You can see there's the symbol for Leo. And the moon making an exact 90-degree angle on July 27th. So Monday, July 27th, there's the moon in Scorpio. And on that day, this is a very potent day. There, not only is it the exact waxing quarter moon, but three other major transits come into exact alignment or perfect on that day. And that is Venus. Here's Venus in Gemini. in an exact square or 90-degree angle to Neptune right here in Pisces. So Venus square Neptune is exact that day. This is the third Venus-Neptune square that has taken place since Venus entered Gemini in May. And Venus has been moving through Gemini for a very long time, long sojourn in this sign, 4 months in this sign. So Venus has been transiting back and forth because it went retrograde in Gemini and made now 3 exact squares to Neptune. So I'll get into the meaning of that one in a moment. But first, let me name the other 2. Venus square Neptune. Mercury is also making its second exact square to Mars on that day, just a little bit later in that day. That is another alignment where they have been tracking with each other. Mercury, like Venus, was retrograde earlier in the summer, and so it passed back in relationship to Mars not that long ago. So we're getting another pass of that. And Mars and Mercury stay in close alignment with each other throughout this month. So there's some important archetypes to track. Again, I'll get into the meaning in a moment. The last of these is Jupiter, which is moving retrograde, makes its exact sextile, second one this year, that happened much earlier this year, to Neptune. So we have Sun square Moon, Venus square Venus square Neptune, Mercury square Mars, and Jupiter sextile Neptune. Now, that's not all going to just come through on that day and, the light switch turns on with all these transits at the beginning of July 27th and turns off at the end. By no means. They just happen to be coming into exact alignment on that day. And it's interesting that they're all happening at once like that. But when you think about transits, you have to think of them coming in like a bell curve, where events that correlate with these qualities start to trickle in as they get closer and closer to each other. And I start paying attention to this when they're about 10 degrees apart. Sometimes a little wider, depending on the planet. But, we can hold 10 degrees, definitely start paying attention at 5 degrees as they're getting closer. And that's when more and more correlations come in. And then when they're exact, it's like we're at the top of the bell curve. That's what's happening on this day. And then it's like the qualities maybe correlate a little bit less, are less frequent, but it's not like they just go away when we're past the exact alignment. The field is still saturated with this archetypal quality. So on the one hand, Venus Neptune will be coming through as this very kind of dreamy, romantic, idealistic, aesthetic, kind of ethereal quality. An image when I was writing about this that came to me was Ophelia from Hamlet, as she is floating in the river strewn with flowers. And of course, there's a great tragedy to Ophelia's story that she drowns in these waters. But there's an exquisite, poignant, ethereal beauty to Ophelia. And that's very much the Venus-Neptune kind of romantic ideal, that quality. And you may remember some of those energies present in May when we had those 2 exact alignments of Venus with Neptune taking place that month. I think I said earlier, by the way, that Venus moved into Gemini in May, but I actually believe it was in April. Can't quite remember that off the top of my head, but I think if my calculations that I'm spinning off in my head right now are right, that's when it happened. So very dreamy, romantic kind of energy, but at the exact same time, Mercury is square to Mars. And I discussed this a bit in the last workshop too, because there was an exact alignment of that in the last lunation cycle not too long ago. And Mercury-Mars can be very argumentative. It's the debater. It's the person who gets their point across very clearly, sharply, sometimes harshly. Words can cut. Words can sting. The tongue becomes the sword. And so we have to be careful of who we might harm with our words. But we can also direct that Martian anger through our words in a way that maybe would be less destructive than perhaps, a more physical expression of violence. So sometimes Mercury can be an aid to Mars, but watch out for arguments, watch out for disagreements. And considering the dreamy, romantic Venus-Neptune dynamic happening at the same time, that may especially show up in romantic relationships. One can kind of imagine such a scenario where perhaps someone has a very idealistic vision of what they would like their relationship to look like, and that vision or ideal then sparks an argument between those partners or those lovers or those friends too. That's one particular scenario that you could imagine with something like this. But to just be conscious of that argumentative side of the Mercury Mars square in particular, how it can kind of jab. And then finally, the last alignment that's happening, that's coming into exactitude that day, but because it's Jupiter and Neptune, which are both outer planets, Jupiter's a little bit more intermediary, not a, totally outer planet. It is an outer planet if you think of it in the ancient system, where Jupiter and Saturn are the outer planets. But Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto are the outer planets. But they move slowly. So this is a longer lasting alignment, one that's been kind of holding the background in check a little bit throughout this year. And Jupiter with Neptune can offer us a broader perspective, a wider kind of spiritual outlook that can offer a certain sense of calm, a sense of optimism. I'll sometimes call this the cosmic optimist, because one is able to hold the larger spiritual context and perspective in mind, even if there is a Mercury-Mars spat going on, or even if one's ideal visions of romantic love happen to be shattering at this time. There's an ability to kind of lean back, chill out a little bit with the Jupiter-Neptune. And so it really can be a wonderful gift and reprieve, especially considering how intense things are at this time. So that Jupiter-Neptune can be like the glass of wine that calms you down a little bit, or the cool shower, or if you're blessed enough to have a lake or a river or a pool or something to cool off in, something like that, where it can be this reminder that things will be okay in the end. Maybe the end being some larger cosmic sense, not the immediate here and now of incarnated reality, but it is that broader spiritual perspective, not one that we want to escape into to completely deny by any means what is happening at the concrete level of the real world, but simply something that can offer us a different, more open perspective and can help hold things in context. So as I'm saying all that, you can hear there is a bit of an escapist shadow side to Jupiter-Neptune, of denying the hard realities of life and wanting to slip away into that term spiritual bypassing, or into a drugged state or stupor, or viewing the world through rose-colored glasses and saying, oh, everything's going to be fine, don't worry about it, which is obviously a complete denial of reality and suffering. So can we hold that complexity rather than simply having it be an escape hatch into daydream and reverie and so on? Can that come in the right doses to keep us uplifted with a sense of spiritual hope? Really, is how I would describe Jupiter-Neptune. So you can see that's a very potent week that we have, and that's especially peaking right at the moon in Scorpio square to the sun in Leo. So now as we continue to move forward and come to the full moon, the full moon takes place on August 3rd, Monday, August 3rd. So you can see that, by the way, it's about a week per between each one of these quadrature alignments. And that, of course, always adds up to about 4 weeks or a month. A month, if you want to pronounce it that way, where you have the root of the moon in there. So the sun in Leo opposite the moon in Aquarius. And if you remember from the Thema Mundi, Aquarius traditionally is ruled by Saturn. And in modern rulership, this has been handed off to Uranus. Now, if we know anything about Saturn and Uranus, they could not be more different archetypally. Saturn is all about structure, rules, discipline, being much more conservative, really kind of following carrying things responsibly in the proper order, the proper course of things. And Uranus is the complete opposite. It's the rebel, it's the trickster, it wants to break all the rules that Saturn is trying to set. So why are these two very different planetary archetypes assigned as traditional or modern rulers of Aquarius? Well, that's a debate that I'm not really going to get into here, but they each have a quality of distance that they can offer to this sign. If you view it more through the Uranian lens, there's an eccentricity to Uranus. If you look at it through, not to Uranus, excuse me, to Aquarius. And if you look at it through the Saturnian lens, there's more of that in the way that Saturn negates. It puts up a wall, a boundary, a distance in that way. And so when the moon, emotions, feelings, relational connection, coziness, the home, all of that is in Aquarius, there's a little bit of a feeling of aloofness or distance there. It's like a cold moon. And so as this moon comes into fruition, becomes the full moon, illuminated by the sun in Leo, the sun at home, there may be a feeling of almost like it's the feeling or the emotion of it is a bit beyond our grasp. The image that came to me as I was writing about this was like, because I always think about the full moon as like the flowering of the seeds of intention that we planted at the new moon. And so this flowering, it's like a cold pearl that is the flower of this particular moon, the Aquarius full moon. So that will take place, as I mentioned, on Monday, August 3rd, in the morning, Pacific time at least. And one of the other transits that is taking place on this day that reaches exact alignment is Mercury, which is still in Cancer, opposite Saturn, which is in Capricorn again. And Mercury opposite Saturn, the experience of that particular combination, Mercury is the mind, the intellect, thinking, learning, education, understanding. It's how we think. It's how we express ourselves. It's how we tell our story. It's how we take in information. And Mercury opposite Saturn, there can be a rigidity to the thinking. There can be a negativity to the thinking. There can be a sense of limits on the mind where maybe there's a feeling of things not being known or not being understood or being misunderstood. Silencing can be a theme with Mercury Saturn. It can also be an appreciation of silence. So that Mercury Saturn opposition happens at the same time as this kind of aloof, emotionally distant Aquarius full moon. My intuition is that day, as it comes into fruition, may have a little bit of a feeling of stillness to it. Perhaps, like an eye of the storm, a contemplative feeling, even if it just lasts for a few hours of the day. So I'll be tracking that to see how that comes through. But one other thing that's important to mention here is that sun-moon opposition, the full moon, is making a T-square, or a square 90-degree angle on either side to Uranus. So there could be some kind of a feeling of the unexpected coming in, this kind of electrical impulse that charges through the field. This can amplify the quality, some of the Uranian qualities that are associated with Aquarius as well. It's kind of eccentric, electrical feeling there. So I realize I'm kind of presenting a picture of opposites in terms of silence, in terms of stillness with the Mercury Saturn, that more contemplative side. But I feel like this full moon, it's not going to feel cozy. It's not going to feel warm. It's not going to feel nurturing in the way that we often think about the moon as showing up. It'll have more of that feeling of distance or aloofness. Now, if we move to the next stage in the lunation cycle, this time the waning quarter moon, that takes place on Tuesday, August 11th, in the morning. And this is now the moon exalted in Taurus. So the moon is like a favored guest in Taurus, a favored guest in Venus's home. And it's squaring off 90-degree angle to the sun in Leo. And I love the image that this evokes of the sun in the lion sign facing off with the bull of Taurus. So you have the lion and the bull facing off with each other. I mean, even talking about that, it kind of evokes these deep mythic images that may feel like they're arising out of like the deep collective unconscious of the lion and the bull. These are both fixed signs. There's a stubbornness to them. And as this fixed lunation cycle is coming towards its close, that with that waning quarter moon, there may be a bit of a feeling of a crunch, a stubbornness. Is this going to move? Is this going to be integrated? Whatever has been set in motion throughout that cycle. So again, I will be curious to see how the feeling of this comes through. Because when we're talking about the moon, whenever we're talking about the moon, we're talking about how it feels in our emotions, how it feels in our body, how it feels in the intimate sphere of our home, family relationships. So because the moon moves so quickly, whenever it touches off with one of the other planets, it's as though we are then more able to emotionally tune into and feel the archetypal qualities that are associated with whatever that particular planetary archetype happens to be. It's like it comes into the core of us. And I so often find that is the case where, on certain days, I'll just be like, why am I feeling that way? And I'll look at the moon, either what sign it's in or what planets it's in relationship to. And it's like, oh, that's why I'm feeling that way, because I am in emotional contact with these particular archetypes, even if it's just for a few hours. Now, finally, coming to the next new moon, finally, our Leo new moon, we have our opportunity to set our intentions for self-actualization in the new moon. And this will take place on August 18th, Tuesday, August 18th. And so here you can see there's the Leo new moon, sun moon conjunction, very close, interestingly, to Mercury. So the mental, the intellectual ideas, thoughts, and so forth will be intimately connected with this next seeding, this next sun moon alignment. And so really kind of thinking about what is your intention, thinking about what you're setting in motion. And because this is taking place in the sign of Leo, ruled by the sun, these intentions can really have to do with yourself, who you are as an individual. Now, the sun can be the symbol of the ego or the self in a fuller sense. And we can sometimes get caught in the egoic side of it. And so when I speak about self-actualization, I'm speaking more in the sense of self in a fuller, encompassing recognition of how our self contains multitudes. To paraphrase Walt Whitman, I contain multitudes. That is what is meant by the self with a capital S, at least as Carl Jung defined it. And Carl Jung, who happened to have his sun in Leo, certainly knew a lot about what it meant to be a self. Not, again, in an egoic sense, not the small self with a capital S, but the self that encompasses and includes the full pantheon of the archetypes that live through us. That's what he means by self. It's a recognition of the whole that is contained within us, that each part is a hologram of the whole. So there is our lunation cycle, primarily moving through the fixed signs, other than, of course, that opening new moon, which is still taking place in a cardinal sign, the sign of Cancer. Now, there are just a few more transits that I want to mention that are happening throughout this month, and then we can open up for dialogue. So I already spoke about how on the waxing quarter moon we have, which is taking place on July 27th, we have those three major transits: Venus square Neptune, Mercury square Mars, and Jupiter sextile Neptune. So mark your memories with July 27th and really just pay attention to what you see coming in that day and how this multifaceted spectrum of archetypal qualities may be coming through for you, for those you're close to. Also paying attention on the world stage, what news is coming in at that time. I have a feeling we'll especially be seeing and we already are seeing the Mercury-Mars argumentative side, the disagreement side of that alignment between Mercury and Mars that's already here. I next want to look at, okay, just come back to speaking directly to you without having the charts there. And the next major alignment that I want to speak to is what Mars is doing. So as we spoke about last time, Mars has entered into the sign of Aries, one of the signs that it rules, and it is in that sign for the rest of the year because Mars is going to turn retrograde in that sign in mid-September, September 9th to be exact. So we'll be talking about that more and more as we lead up to it. And as Mars moves through that cardinal sign of Aries, it is going to be squaring, so making a 90-degree angle to that great stellium, Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto, in Capricorn. Now, the last time that Mars was in alignment with Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto was in March and April of this year. Now, we remember how March and April played out. That was when the pandemic really ignited and spread very rapidly, kind of like a wildfire. And that's the effect of Mars igniting that outer planet transit alignment. So that March and April, I think, are going to be mirrored in some ways by what is unfolding essentially August through the end of the year. With some waves coming in and out, of course, as Mars moves back and forth. But that first alignment of Mars to one of the planets in the stellium comes through exactly on August 4th. That's when Mars squares Jupiter, the first out of those three in the order they're in right now, because it's Jupiter and then Pluto and then Saturn. So Mars makes an exact square to Jupiter on August 4th. And as we know, Jupiter tends to expand, to amplify whatever it touches. And in this case, it's Mars's fiery, volatile, angry, potentially violent energy. Now, Jupiter does have an uplifting quality. This can be a kind of heroic in a positive sense energy that can come through, like the warrior hero. So it's not all necessarily negative, but Pluto and Saturn are nearby. So we have to remember that Mars is activating that whole alignment through this time. And I have a feeling we'll be seeing some kind of grandiosity, some posturing. With Mars Jupiter, there can be a bit of an aggressive arrogance that can come through. But at the same time, it can also be, like the good sportsman or good sportswoman, kind of being able to move through high energy situations in a positive way or with a successful outcome. So there may be some potential for a diffusion of tensions or a diffusion of anger, hopefully at least at the personal level, if not at the collective level. Then Mars continues to move. It's just moving through Aries. And so the next planet that it'll come into alignment with in that stellium is Pluto. And that happens exactly on August 13th. So right in the middle of the month. And it's pretty hard to deny the intensity of Mars with Pluto. This is the energy of volcanic eruptions, the shifting of tectonic plates, wildfires. It's the ferocity of the hunting animal, like the wildcat going after her prey, fierce teeth. There's something very instinctual, very intense, very biological about Mars with Pluto. So there is a potential for this to erupt in potentially destructive ways. It also, Mars with Pluto, does have a tremendous a will to push through and survive any obstacle. So we have to remember that side of Mars Pluto too, that there is a deep kind of primal strength to Mars Pluto that can withstand a tremendous amount. But I do hold some concerns that as Mars sweeps through the stellium, and especially that Mars-Pluto alignment, that what has already been a very violent and conflictual summer may be heating up even more. So just to hold that in our consciousness and to hold that in mind too, in an attempt at least to not exacerbate it or to find ways to redirect and rechannel that energy at a personal level that may hold some effect, at least ripple out to the collective. Now, that's Mars's movement. It won't come into alignment with Saturn until the next lunation cycle. So I'm not going to be talking about that here. But know that that is coming. Mars square to Saturn will be following that. And a couple other transits that I want to mention. These aren't alignments between planets, but actually planets moving through signs. First of all, Mercury. Mercury retrograde is over. Mercury was moving through Cancer for quite some time. It kind of felt like Mercury, the mind, our ability to communicate and think, was just caught in a riptide and getting pulled one way and then pulled the other way. Very kind of saturated mercurial energy. But it is now direct, and it will move out of the sign of Cancer, that water sign, and into the sign of Leo on August 4th. So it happens to be the same day that Mars is in that exact square to Jupiter. So Mercury is going to have a chance to dry off in Leo's heat. Maybe, the thinking will be a little bit more clear, more rational, that kind of more direct thinking that we get when Mercury is in the sun sign in Leo. So that's one big shift taking place on August 4th, so near the beginning of the month. The other shift is Venus is ingressing into a new sign. As I mentioned, Venus has been in Gemini, so it's been hosted by Mercury in Gemini for 4 months, long time to be in that sign. And it's almost like we've forgotten what it feels like if Venus is in another sign where we're having to express how we feel about people that we love entirely just through words and communication. I mean, how many of you have been maintaining loving relationships with, whether it's friends, family, maybe even partners for some, or with lovers, just over Zoom or over the phone or over text message? That's Venus moving through Gemini. And now Venus is going to be moving into Cancer. So again, that moon ruled sign, that watery sign. And Venus in Cancer has a sweetness to it, an innocence to it. And we're probably going to start really feeling our hearts a lot. Our hearts are probably going to start to feel very sensitive, emotionally attuned, loving, soft, just very kind of permeable and a little bit mushy. And this is like young love energy, sweet love, innocent love. The sweetness, by the way, of Venus in Cancer, or when you get a Moon Venus alignment, can sometimes show up in a more literal external expression where we just crave sweet things. Ice cream and cupcakes and chocolate and cookies and just like the sugariness of Venus in Cancer. Now, it may not show up like that for you individually, or it may show up more at an emotional level, relational level. But I do always like to mention that correlation. It's like the cupcake transit or something like that. So those are the big ingresses. Mercury moving out of Cancer and into Leo, Venus moving out of Gemini and into Cancer. And then finally, the last big shift that I want to mention is that on August 15th, so the day after Mars is in that, or 2 days after Mars is in that exact square to Pluto, August 15th, Uranus. So Uranus, the archetype of change, liberation, revolution, disruption, awakening. Uranus turns retrograde. All the other outer planets are already retrograde. Jupiter, Saturn, Neptune, Pluto, they're all retrograde. And now Uranus joins them. And it's kind of interesting that now all the outer planets, Jupiter through Pluto, will be retrograde, and all the inner planets, Mercury, Venus, and Mars, are direct. Now, this isn't so unusual, as I've talked about before, for the outer planets to be retrograde. They are retrograde half the year, and that's because they are further out in the solar system than we are on Earth, and half the year because we're going around the sun, passing them at a much slower speed, and then we're going around the sun again and passing them still at a slower speed. So it looks like they're going forward and back because we're going around. So that's the astronomy that is behind the astronomy that's behind retrogrades. That motion. So it's not that unusual for the outer planets to be retrograde. So, always be conscious of someone who is saying, "Oh, I'm feeling terrible because Saturn is retrograde." Well, it's like, are you feeling terrible today, or have you been feeling terrible for half the year? Because that's a very large correlation to be drawing on for maybe a single day's mood. That's when you might want to look to the moon for how you're feeling. Anyway, that was a little bit of a caricature, but just to be cognizant of the fact that the outer planets are retrograde about half of the year. But now all of them, starting on August 15th, will be retrograde, which is just worth making note of. And what I love about retrogrades is that they remind us that we on Earth are on a moving planet. That's why we have retrogrades. If we were on a stationary space, at the center of the cosmos, as was believed until the Copernican revolution, and everything else was moving around us in perfect circles, there wouldn't be retrogrades. And it was the fact there were retrogrades that we saw the planets move back and forth against the backdrop of the fixed stars, that many philosophers and astronomers and astrologers were called to figure out what Plato called the problem of the planets, and to understand what the motion of the planets was. And of course, the solution ended up coming, initiated by Copernicus, the Copernican revolution, and then solidified and figured out by Kepler, Galileo, and finally Newton, working out all the different mathematical and other theorems that supported the heliocentric hypothesis. So retrogrades, whenever we look up night after night and we see a planet seeming to move backward from its normal course, that reminds us that we're moving, even though we can't feel it on this Earth. And I wanted to bring this workshop to a close by sharing a section from a poem written by the great poet Drew Dellinger who happens also to be a friend of mine, I'm glad to say. And he was a student for many years, received his PhD from the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program at the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco, or CIIS. So Drew Dellinger is an amazing cosmological poet, and he wrote a poem called Planetize the Movement. And I highly recommend that you look up the full poem, whether you read it to yourself or look up a video of Drew performing it. He's a great performer. But I just wanted to share these few lines from the end of that poem that illustrates this point I'm bringing forward. Drew writes, "We are standing on a planet that is shooting through space, and it's time we started acting like it. Globalize liberation. Planetize the movement. You can't stop the Earth's revolution."